Hey, welcome back to Code Reviews. Today's video, we're going to massively improve our UI user experience flow. Previously, we've been working off of a single dashboard that had every component loaded, and it had a Google sign-in button, and everything was in one place. Today, we're going to update our UI to be much more representative of what we want the user to interact with. So as you see, what we have now is just a sign-in button that says, please sign in with a valid Gmail to continue. So we'll click that and we'll sign in as our admin user. First thing you see is we have a logout button, which works. It logs out the user, brings us back to where we were before. We can log back in. We have a message. We can create a new user, which we've done. We can even delete users using the delete user button. So I can delete this user that I just created. Great. So if we log out from here, we can log back in. We'll log in as a regular user. So we just have the free user role. We cannot create a new user. I did this just to show that the roles are working. But what you'll also notice is that you can't even see the admin view. The admin view is blocked because we're only showing that to users who are admins. So this is much closer to what you would see in a real app. And we'll go through the code today to see how we did that. So looking at the slides, we will be improving the user flow, login flow today. Our code review objectives are 1, front-end user handling enhancements, 2, back-end user handling enhancements, and 3, some miscellaneous improvements like replacing the JPA repository with the BaseJPA repository and removing the CSRF from our security config because it turns out with JWT and Spring Security, we don't really need it. So to begin, let's look at the front-end user enhancements. The first thing that we did was create an authenticated and an unauthenticated view. So we wanted to show one thing if the user is authenticated, and we wanted to show another view if the user was authenticated. They could be an admin or not. To do that, we enhanced the user model. So I like to link the front end and the back end models, and I kind of have to do that manually. You can use things like protobuf or Apache Thrift, but I kind of just manually enforce the modeling. So this is literally the back end authenticated user projection. It has data associated with it: the first name, the last name, the username, role names, is authenticated. We have an is not authenticated, an is admin, and an is not admin. And I like to have explicit is nots because it's just easier to use in a conditional than to have an exclamation point is admin that really means is not admin. So we've created and extended this backend user projection for tracking, when we load a user, are they an admin? Are they authenticated? The next thing that we did was load in user information from the backend. So we created a user core service. So we've been using Angular services, user core service. We've been using Angular services, and we've created a private subject using RxJS of that backend authentication user projection type. And we set it by default to is authenticated false, is not authenticated true. So we're creating a default subject, and then publicly we make it an observable so that we can subscribe to it and use that async pipe. And we make it discrete until changed. So I'm not going to go over RxJS a lot, but this is pretty simple usage, and you can look at the RxJS docs about what we're doing. But this is how we're going to track the user and the user's information so that each component can subscribe to it and get the latest state, and they can update accordingly. Now we have an initialize user object or a method which returns a backend user authenticated user projection. And essentially what this is doing is it loads an authenticated user's information with a valid JSON Web Token. Otherwise, it signs out any remnants of the user. So it looks for a valid JWT in the local storage. If it doesn't find one that's valid, it automatically signs the user out and destroys what's there. So essentially, if there is an existing token, then we will try to update the current user. And if not, we will purge the user. And if there are any types of errors, we will sign out and if there's nothing there, we will call sign out. So sign out is pretty simple. You simply just purge the user, which destroys the token, and it sets the current user to this unauthenticated constant. So you just set it to a constant, and that's sign out. And then you do the social sign out. So you call Google social sign-in service and you sign out from that as well. And then if you're good, you can do update current user and you pass in the user that you get. So we have this get user info controller, which hits the backend. So what you'll see as we come up is we've created a get user information method controller API endpoint, which we will hit to get user information, and it returns that backend user projection for us. Assuming that works, then we pass that user, if it exists, to update current user, which simply will set the next means set the subject that you have to that user, and then we just return a deep copy of it. So this is the user core service that we're using to load when the app loads, we try and pull the user information. When you do a sign in through Google, you load the user information. Then we utilize those user properties that we have to conditionally decide what HTML to show. So if we go back to our authentication dashboard HTML, we've used Angular's ngIf to say, if we've subscribed to the current user service current user, it's an observable async pipe. So when this resolves and the subscription's there, then we let that be the user object. ngIf, if that user is authenticated, show the logout button, show the welcome, let them create a user, let them view users. And if they're also an admin, user is admin, then show the delete user button. Now, if they are not authenticated, then you can say, please sign in. And so I could make these their own standalone components, but for now they're all put in the dashboard. But we've basically loaded the user, all the information that we need, and then we've used that information to decide what HTML we're going to show them without juggling different pages. And this will continue to improve, but this is already miles ahead of where we were. We also needed to create a logout flow. You need a logout button for users to use. So we created a logout button component, which is very simple. It has one method, logout user, and it calls the user service sign out. And we simply attached that button. When you click that button, call logout, it says logout. And we just added this logout button as part of the dashboard. Very simple. Angular is really paying dividends here. And that calls user core service sign out, which we've already walked through. So that's the front end, but the front end relies on the back end. So simple enough, but the back end has to actually send the data that we need. So when we look at the back end, first thing we're going to do is we're going to extend the user entity and the user data transfer objects. We have to add is authenticated and is admin properties for the front end to use, so that when we ask the back end for data on a user, in that object is the information that we need and that we can map to. And we actually use open projections to set those values in the user DTO. So I created an authenticated user projection in it's an interface. I like to use these. There are many different ways you can use. I've created some shorts about this. But for me, this is easiest, cleanest, and even though it takes a little bit longer, it's still fine. But we get the first name, we get the last name, we get the username. We've shown how we get the role names using the get role names helper method in the user entity. I created a couple more for get is authenticated. I created a get is authenticated method. Is not, get is admin, get is not admin. So once again, you can see in the user.java, we have these custom getters that we're calling the open projections. So get authenticated by default is true, and get is not authenticated is the opposite of get authenticated. Get admin, check the role names, see if it contains role admin. If it doesn't, then it's not an admin. So we're mapping the projection using this stuff. Where do we use this? We use it in the user repository. So we have created a new query in the user repository that says return user info for enabled users by username. And we've specified this is similar to another function that we had. So we called this one out specifically because we want it to return an authenticated user projection. So we'll select a user from the user entities table, and alias it to user, where user.username equals the username we pass in, and enabled is true. And so when this method is called, we will map that data, if it's there, to this authenticated user projection object and have it populated. So the reason authentication defaults to true in this case is because when we call this, by definition, they are now authenticated, and that's kind of protected down the line. One other thing I'll show you is I've differentiated authenticated user projection with a generic user projection, because I use find by enabled as true in other places. And here, you just want to get the first name, the last name, the username, and the roles. You don't need any of that other stuff, so we don't set it. So I've created a generic user projection and an authenticated user projection view. Now, if you look at where we use return user information for enabled users by username, you can see we use it in the user service impl in a couple of places. So we have a get user information where we pass in the string username, and we simply just return the query that we just had here. So you can see where are we using this? You're using it in a new user info controller that we have. So we have locked down this user info get request. You have to have the free user role. So you have to be authenticated and be at least a free user to get info for yourself. And here, all you simply do is return that user information using the username that you're pulling from the authenticated user. In a previous video, I showed you how we're using the JWT to create a user object. And so you already are an authenticated user. You have to have role free users before you even get here. And this is where you get the user info. So we've gone over the two models. We have an authenticated user projection, which maps to the front end when I showed you. We have a generic user projection, which doesn't have all the bells and whistles that we need. We're not using it for authentication. And then we added the new get user information endpoint, which calls the get user information user service for an authenticated user using the query return user info for enabled user by username. So all of that is how we map the backend, which is really nice. It's really clean. There's not much confusion there, and the backend's furnishing all the information that we can then use on the front end. Miscellaneous improvements. So one thing that I did was update the JPA repository interface that I was using with the base JPA repository. So if you look at the user repository, you can see that I have base JPA repository here. It comes from this hypersistence module that I've added. And the reason I did this was because Vlad M, he had called out some anti-patterns, particularly save anti-pattern. And you can read more about this, but you shouldn't use it. I was using it. I shouldn't have been using it. I changed to his library because the save isn't even an option. And so I changed things to either update or persist, which is more appropriate. So I wanted to make that change. I wanted to tell you guys why I made that change. And then I also removed the reference to CSRF. So if you look in the security config, I have just commented out, the CSRF with defaults. And the reason I did this is because it's not needed with JWT authorization. By using the OAuth2 resource server DSL, you are telling Spring Security that you are not using cookie-based authentication. Therefore, you do not need CSRF protection. A little bit more, your browser does not know how to handle this kind of authorization, and that is also why you have to manually add this header in every request. So the browser doesn't know anything. We're manually adding it as part of Angular as our interceptor, and so that's what's going on there. And so I made that change as well. That's really it. The code is obviously available to download and to use. I encourage it. If you want to stay on, I'm going to just click through all of the actual PR. But other than that, subscribe, comment, let me know if you like it or you want to see something different. All right, so I updated the docs per usual. App.component. So when the app loads, I initialize the user first thing to see if we can get the user information. I updated the dashboard for conditional views. Authentication dashboard component. I simply handled the user. So we have create a Google user subscription, authentication core service, the user service. We're just making sure that we're calling the user information, create Google user, and updating the user in the front end and through the component. I added the logout user button. I have some files that I haven't filled out yet for the testing and the CSS. The logout button I showed you. It's very simple. View users, I simply just updated the name to be exact about what model we're using. I updated that backend user projection model. I updated the name. I created a front-end user GTO that I don't actually use anywhere. Should probably have gotten rid of that. The authentication core service. So we have the create Google user. What we simply did was update the references so that we're using this unauthenticated backend user projection if things fail. Otherwise, we're using the backend authentication user projection. We're using that type everywhere, so I had to update the type. The beauty of TypeScript is that it's type safe. The user core service, I showed you all of that. We're setting up the user, making it subscribable or observable so we can subscribe to it. Initializing the user, updating the current user, signing out, getting the user info, and purging the user, just basic user flow things that we need to do. I added the controller to our local environment. This is the library, Hypersistence Utils Hibernate 60. So to use the base JPA repository, this is the library you need. You also have to enable JPA repositories and call out this base JPA repository impl class for everything to work. I updated this so you can see I had cores, but then I got rid of cores. You don't need it. Or not cores, CSRF. I updated the types that here. So instead of a string, it's returning a user projection. The user controller, we're using the user service. I've added that. And then I've updated save and flush to just persist, which is all I need. I'm updating subscribed user to role admin, so actually do the stuff. We're using updates rather than save and flush. Generic user projection, and we're adding that controller. So this is really just fixing the compiler errors, writing some wrongs, as they say. We added get user from JWT into the user service. Or no, we didn't add it. We just moved it up, put it in alphabetical order. Then we added get user information to the interface, and then we rearrange things, but we added get user information, which I showed you. This is the library. We had to add it here as well, and we just created properties, scopable properties for these things. I actually need to get rid of this. It's not really needed. I will get rid of that eventually when I no longer create these fake users. I created the custom getters for the open projection. That's here, custom getters. This is the authenticated user projection that we walked through. This is the generic user projection. I just renamed it so that it was clear like why we should use it and what its purpose was. I updated the role repository to extend base JPA repository. I updated the user repository to use the base JPA repository. This now returns a generic user projection rather than just user projection. And then this new query returns authenticated user projections. I have a null check here. So I noticed that sometimes given name can be null. So this substring method throws a null pointer error. So if that's the case, I just add a blank. Otherwise, I use what Google gives me. And then, yep, all I did here was mark the versions that I'm using. If you're still here, great. Let me know if you have issues. Let's collaborate. Let's see what I can teach you. All right, thanks.